This lesson is going to be on limited government versus unlimited government. The United States has a limited government, and another name for our limited government is constitutional government. It's called a constitutional government because we have a constitution. And this is an image of our Constitution. The Constitution is a document where the rules for our government are written down. And these rules explain how the government is supposed to work and what the government can and cannot do. Under our Constitution, we have a democracy. And a democracy is where the people get to vote to choose their leaders. And here is a photograph that shows all of the US presidents that are currently living. One of the features of our Constitution is that our government has a concept called separation of powers and checks and balances. The separation of powers means that because our government has 3 branches, each of those branches are separate. There is the executive branch, which is controlled by the president, and then we have the legislative branch, which is controlled by Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then we also have the judiciary, which is controlled at the top by the Supreme Court, and then there's lower federal courts underneath the Supreme Court. Now, these 3 branches sort of check each other's power. For instance, if the president issues an executive order, the US Supreme Court has the power to later on decide that that executive order is invalid if they say that it is unconstitutional, if it goes against the rules that are in the Constitution. They can strike down his order. Also, if the Congress passes a law or tries to pass a law and the president doesn't agree with it, the president has the power to veto that law and prevent it from happening. And then Congress would have the opportunity possibly to override it if they can get 2/3 of their members to override that veto. And sometimes the president and the legislative branch agree and a law goes into existence, it's passed by Congress, and the president signs it. And then the Supreme Court can decide that maybe that law is unconstitutional. And they can hear the case and they can decide to strike it down. So that's one way how these 3 branches check each other. Okay, they check each other's power. There's another feature of our Constitution that also puts a check on the president's power, and that is the president has a term limit. He can only be elected twice, and so there is a maximum of only 8 years that he can serve in office. And just by the fact that he's only going to be in power for 8 years puts a limit on his power, and that limit is written into the Constitution in the 22nd Amendment. So the Constitution is what limits the power of the government. And because we have this Constitution limiting the government's power, that prevents tyranny. And tyranny is when the government takes away the freedom that the people have. Okay? And so we believe that tyranny is a very bad thing in this country. We don't agree with it. That's why we have a Constitution, to help preserve freedom. And in this picture, this is a scene from another country decades ago in the 1920s in Russia when it was called the USSR. And in this scene, there is a soldier who is marching some Russians off to prison, to a labor camp. And this is an example of tyranny. These people were arrested by the government, possibly because they voiced an opinion where they disagreed with the government, or they said something bad about the leadership in the government, or the government just had them arrested because they wanted to have more people work for them in a labor camp. So they're using them as slave labor. So this is an example of tyranny, and this is the kind of thing that our Constitution prevents because of things like separation of powers and the checks and balances system. But in some countries, there is no check on a government's power. And so when there is no check on the government's power, and the government has complete, unlimited power over its people, that system is called totalitarianism. And that is the worst form of tyranny, when the government has unlimited power over its people. And in a totalitarian government, that is the opposite of what we have. We have a limited constitutional government, and totalitarianism is the complete opposite. And totalitarianism is the most extreme form of tyranny. So in a totalitarian system, the government has all of the power, and its power is unlimited. So the people do not have any freedom. They cannot make their own choices. They do not have the power to vote, so if they're unhappy with their leaders, they're stuck. They can't change them. And they have no freedom of speech. They have no freedom to practice their religion. They have no freedom to start a business. They have no freedom to move away. Their choices are very limited. So in conclusion, the United States is a limited constitutional government. It's the exact opposite of what exists in some other countries, like North Korea, for instance, which is a totalitarian system. And the Constitution was designed by the founders specifically to limit the power of the government, because that is something they were very concerned about. They were concerned about a government having too much power. And so their Constitution that they wrote and that we still have is one of the key things that preserves our freedom.